Something has happened to Pastor Creflo Dollar, something so unexpected, so heavy, that even those closest to him admit they never imagined this moment would ever come. For years, his name has hovered at the center of power, influence, and unshakable confidence. But overnight, a wave of devastating news has shaken his ministry, his followers, and even his critics to the core. And the truth behind it all is far more complicated than anyone realizes. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear goes far beyond headlines, rumors, or opinion. This is the part of the story no one has dared to say out loud until now. Before we dive into the full story, you need to understand something crucial. What has unfolded around Pastor Creflo Dollar in recent days is not just another church headline or another moment of online speculation. This situation strikes at the very foundation of his legacy, his teachings, his leadership, and the trust millions of people placed in him for decades. And the most shocking part? Almost nobody saw it coming. Not his supporters, not his critics, and certainly not the ministry teams that have been by his side through countless storms. Because what started as a whisper behind closed doors suddenly erupted into a public moment that left church communities stunned. You won't believe the chain of events that led to this turning point, and even more, you won't believe the reactions from those who once defended him with everything they had. By the end of this video, you'll understand the full magnitude of what has happened, the hidden tensions that built up over time, and the harsh reality that finally came crashing down. And this is where things shift, because the story you think you know is only the surface. For years, Pastor Creflo Dollar has been viewed as a towering figure in modern American ministry. Whether you agreed with him or not, you couldn't deny his reach, his influence, or the power of his voice. His sermons traveled across nations, his conferences filled massive arenas, and his name became synonymous with prosperity preaching on a global scale. Some saw him as a spiritual mentor. Others criticized him as a controversial figure, but everyone recognized that he stood firmly at the center of the conversation. And then, unexpectedly, everything shifted. It began quietly, far quieter than anyone expected for a leader of his stature. A brief message circulated among church insiders, a message that hinted something had gone terribly wrong behind the scenes. No details at first, just a sense of urgency, a tone of concern, a sudden disruption in the carefully managed image that had surrounded Creflo Dollar for so long. And as the message spread, the silence around it became even louder. Members began asking questions, staff began scrambling for answers, and faithful supporters who had followed him for decades felt a chill they couldn't explain. All they knew was that something was coming, something serious, something heavy, something that would force the ministry to confront a reality they never expected to face. That was the moment everything changed, because within hours, whispers turned into discussions, discussions turned into concern, and concern turned into the devastating news no one saw coming. And once it reached the public, it hit with the force of a wave that swept across faith communities everywhere. People were confused, stunned, and hungry for answers. But here's the part most people don't know. Behind closed doors, long before the news reached the world, tensions had already been building. Quiet disagreements, hidden struggles, private challenges, and they created the perfect storm that eventually exploded into the moment we're discussing today. But what exactly triggered this collapse? What was the breaking point that pushed everything over the edge? That's where the story takes an even more dramatic turn, and the truth behind that turning point is far more complicated than anyone expected. Long before the devastating news became public, there were quiet signs, subtle moments that at the time seemed insignificant, yet now, looking back, they reveal a picture that was slowly forming behind the polished sermons and confident stage presence. These were the unseen battles, the hidden pressures, and the mounting tensions that very few people ever witnessed. And for Pastor Creflo Dollar, these pressures were coming from every direction. Inside the ministry, longtime staff members began noticing shifts. Meetings that once ended with clear direction suddenly stretched longer, filled with disagreements that never used to surface. Projects that normally move smoothly were stalled by unexpected conflicts. Even trusted advisors who had been with Dollar through years of controversy began pulling back, sensing that something fundamental was changing. Some blamed the overwhelming demands of maintaining such a massive global ministry. Others whispered about internal disputes, leadership conflicts, or decisions that created friction among his closest associates. But the truth is, the weight of public expectation had been pressing on him for years. Every sermon, every statement, every move was scrutinized, not just by his followers, but by critics who seemed to wait for any mistake with eager anticipation. And the pressure only intensified when financial concerns began raising questions. Supporters wanted transparency, critics demanded explanations, and within the leadership, opinions on how to handle these mounting concerns began to clash. For the first time, the unified team behind Creflo Dollar found itself divided, unsure of how to navigate the growing storm. Behind closed doors, pastors and leaders who had stood firmly with him for decades quietly expressed worry. Some felt he was stretching himself too thin. Others feared the ministry was drifting into territory that would be difficult to come back from. And as these concerns slowly built, they formed cracks that would eventually give way under the weight of unexpected events. But here's where things become even more intense. While the ministry wrestled with internal struggles, outside forces were pushing just as hard. Media attention was ramping up, former members were speaking out, past controversies were resurfacing at the worst possible time, and each new wave of criticism ignited fresh tension within the organization. For Creflo Dollar, it wasn't just about criticism, it was about the feeling that the world he had built, his influence, his message, his legacy, was starting to tilt in ways he could no longer fully control. And when a leader begins to feel that loss of control, the smallest issue can spark a storm. These pressures collided in a perfect, devastating moment, a moment that would trigger the news we're discussing today, a moment that would expose the emotional, spiritual, and organizational battles that had been quietly building beneath the surface for too long. But what exactly was that moment? What final event pushed everything past the point of no return? The moment that finally changed everything for Pastor Creflo Dollar didn't arrive with fanfare. It wasn't a dramatic announcement or a public confrontation. In fact, it began quietly, almost imperceptibly, but behind the calm surface, forces were converging in a way that would make even the most seasoned observers stop and take notice. And when it finally broke, the impact rippled through his ministry, his followers, and the wider faith community in ways that are still being felt today. It all started with a series of internal decisions that at the time seemed minor. A postponed meeting here, a staff reorganization there, slight adjustments to the ministry's messaging. Taken individually, none of these moves would have raised alarm, but collectively, they signaled something far more serious, a leadership struggling to regain balance under intense scrutiny. And for those closest to him, the signs were unmistakable. There was tension in the air, a sense of urgency and whispers of disagreement that could no longer be contained behind closed doors. And then came the trigger, the event that tipped the scale and forced the ministry into the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. While exact details are still emerging, insiders revealed that it involved a clash of expectations, accountability concerns, and a very public misstep that could not be ignored. This wasn't a small controversy or a rumor that could fade with time. It was a moment that exposed vulnerabilities that had long been hidden, vulnerabilities that made even the most loyal supporters question what was happening at the heart of the ministry. Once this breaking point hit, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Social media erupted with speculation, video clips from past sermons resurfaced, and news outlets began scrutinizing every move made by Dollar and his team. What had been a private struggle behind the scenes was now a global conversation. And while criticism came quickly, there was also a sense of shock and disbelief from those who had stood by him for years. Many asked themselves the same question: how could someone who seemed so confident, so untouchable, be caught in such a precarious position? And here's where it gets even more dramatic. Not only was the ministry facing external pressure, but internal fractures began to widen. Staff members who had once been unwavering supporters started voicing concerns publicly. Financial transparency issues that simmered in the background suddenly became front-page topics for discussion among congregants. And perhaps most importantly, the emotional toll on Pastor Dollar himself became evident. He was no longer just managing a ministry, he was navigating a storm of public scrutiny, personal stress, and spiritual responsibility all at once.